Korea's death mall, 502 dead and 40 missing inside high-end department store. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most devastating peacetime disasters in South Korean history, a story of greed, corruption, and unimaginable tragedy that unfolded in the heart of Seoul's most affluent district. This is the story of the Sampoong Department Store collapse, where a symbol of economic prosperity became a tomb for over 500 people in just 20 seconds. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this case involves real victims and grieving families. We'll handle this story with the respect and sensitivity it deserves while examining how such a preventable tragedy could occur. If you appreciate detailed, thoroughly researched true crime content, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow. Now let's step back to Seoul, South Korea, in the summer of 1995. Part 1. Seoul's gleaming surface. The summer heat hung heavy over Seoul on June 29, 1995. In the affluent Seocho district of Gangnam, the afternoon sun beat down on streets lined with luxury boutiques, expensive restaurants, and gleaming high-rises. This was the face of South Korea's economic miracle, a neighborhood that embodied the nation's transformation from war-torn poverty to Asian tiger prosperity in just 4 decades. At the heart of this district stood the Sampoong Department Store, a bright pink building that had become a landmark since opening its doors in July 1990. 5 stories of retail paradise rose above 4 basement levels, connected to a second wing by an elegant atrium lobby. The store's distinctive cotton candy pink exterior made it impossible to miss, a beacon drawing shoppers from across Seoul with promises of designer fashion, electronics, cosmetics, and fine dining. On this particular Thursday, the store was busier than usual. Despite the oppressive heat, approximately 1,500 customers and employees moved through the climate-controlled interior, browsing the latest fashions, sampling cosmetics, shopping for electronics, or dining in one of the 8 restaurants on the 5th floor. The Sampoong Department Store attracted roughly 40,000 visitors daily during its 5 years of operation, establishing itself as one of Seoul's premier shopping destinations. For most people inside the building, June 29th seemed like any ordinary day, albeit uncomfortably warm. The air conditioning had been mysteriously turned off, leaving shoppers and staff to endure the stifling humidity that characterizes Seoul summers. Customers complained to store clerks, asking why such a prestigious establishment would operate without proper cooling. The employees, just as uncomfortable and confused, had no real answers. Management had made the decision, and they were simply told to keep working. 19-year-old Park Seung-hyun worked in the children's department on the 1st basement level. Even without air conditioning, she maintained her professional demeanor, helping customers select clothing for their kids, processing purchases, restocking shelves. It was just another shift in what she thought would be another ordinary day. Years later, she would recall that despite the heat, despite the minor inconveniences, life continued normally. Customers shopped, workers worked, the rhythms of commerce carried on. 18-year-old Yoo Ji-hwan, another store clerk, dealt with increasingly irritated customers who questioned why Sampoong, of all places, would have non-functioning air conditioning. Based on later testimony, employees working the floor that day weren't informed about the building's structural issues. The deliberate shutdown of the cooling units on the roof and management's attempts to reduce stress on the failing ceiling remained known only to upper management. Above her head, cracks were spreading like spider webs across concrete that could no longer bear its burden. On the fifth floor, where 8 traditional Korean restaurants attracted crowds with their ondol floor heating and authentic cuisine, diners sat cross-legged on warm floors, enjoying bibimbap and bulgogi, completely unaware that the floor beneath them was slowly giving way. The restaurants had been particularly busy for weeks, drawing customers who appreciated both the food and the commanding views of Gangnam from their elevated perch. Outside, Seoul throbbed with the energy of a city on the rise. South Korea had spent the past decade cementing its position as an economic powerhouse. The 1988 Summer Olympics had put Seoul on the world stage, showcasing gleaming infrastructure and technological prowess. In the years since, construction cranes had become permanent fixtures of the skyline. New buildings seemed to sprout overnight. The economy was expanding at breathtaking speed. But beneath this gleaming surface, serious problems festered. The construction boom that followed the Olympics had overwhelmed local companies, prohibited from hiring international contractors due to protectionist regulations. South Korean construction firms found themselves juggling too many projects with too little oversight. Speed and profit took priority over safety and quality. Corners were cut, bribes were paid, warnings were ignored. The Sampoong Department Store was a perfect embodiment of this dangerous combination of ambition and negligence. What looked from the outside like a monument to prosperity was, in reality, a disaster waiting to happen. Every structural decision, every modification, every ignored warning had been building toward this moment. The building had been doomed from its inception, and now, after 5 years of operation, it was finally about to fail in the most catastrophic way possible. But for the 1,500 people inside at 5:57 that evening, the danger remained invisible. The structural fractures spreading through concrete columns, the groaning of overstressed steel, the building slowly surrendering to forces it was never designed to withstand. All of this was happening beyond their awareness. They were simply going about their lives, making purchases, eating meals, earning wages, with no indication that they were standing inside what would soon become South Korea's deadliest peacetime disaster. Part 2. The Economic Miracle and its Dark Side. To understand how the Sampoong Department Store collapse could happen, we need to understand the context of South Korea's explosive growth in the decades leading up to 1995. This wasn't just a story about one corrupt developer or one poorly constructed building. It was a systemic failure born from a culture that prioritized rapid development over public safety, that valued economic growth above human life. The transformation of South Korea following the Korean War remains one of the most remarkable economic stories of the 20th century. In 1953, when the armistice finally brought an end to 3 years of devastating conflict, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. The war had destroyed much of the nation's infrastructure. Seoul lay in ruins. Poverty and hunger were widespread. The future looked bleak. But over the following decades, South Korea underwent a transformation so dramatic that economists coined a term for it: the Asian tiger economy. Through a combination of authoritarian planning, export-focused industrialization, and heavy investment in education, South Korea began its climb from the ashes. By the 1980s, this once devastated nation had become a global manufacturing powerhouse, producing everything from ships to semiconductors to automobiles. The 1988 Summer Olympics marked South Korea's coming-out party on the world stage. Hosting the Olympics was both a point of national pride and a catalyst for massive infrastructure development. Seoul needed to present itself as a world-class city capable of hosting athletes and tourists from around the globe. This meant new stadiums, new hotels, new roads, new everything. The construction boom that preceded the Olympics was staggering in scale. Cranes filled the skyline. Entire neighborhoods were demolished and rebuilt. New commercial districts rose where farmland had been only years before. The government poured resources into making Seoul shine, and private developers rushed to capitalize on the opportunity. But this breakneck pace of development came with serious costs. South Korean law at the time prohibited foreign construction companies from signing contracts for projects in Seoul. This protectionist policy was intended to benefit local firms, but it had unintended consequences. Domestic construction companies suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with more projects than they could properly manage. The results were predictable. Quality suffered. Safety standards were ignored. Buildings were erected quickly and cheaply to meet impossible deadlines. Corners were cut at every stage of construction. Inferior materials were used. Structural specifications were ignored. Building codes existed on paper but were rarely enforced in practice. Corruption became endemic in the construction industry. City officials, responsible for inspections and code enforcement, found themselves in a position to demand bribes in exchange for looking the other way. Developers, eager to cut costs and speed timelines, were more than willing to pay. A culture of graft and negligence took hold, creating an environment where dangerous buildings could be approved and occupied despite obvious safety concerns. The broader South Korean culture of the time reinforced these dangerous practices. The nation's rapid development had created what some observers called an egocentric society, where individuals competed ruthlessly to privatize resources and maximize personal gain. The collective trauma of war and poverty had given way to a hustle culture obsessed with wealth accumulation and status. Success was measured in one and real estate, not in the safety or well-being of the community. This was the environment into which Lee Joon entered when he decided to build what would become the Sampoong Department Store. Lee embodied many of the traits that characterized South Korea's economic elite during this era. Documents from the trial and investigative reports reveal a pattern of ruthless ambition and a consistent disregard for regulations. When he looked at a plot of land in the Seocho district of Seoul, the evidence suggests he saw past the site's history as a former landfill with questionable soil stability. What mattered was its prime location in one of Seoul's most affluent neighborhoods, a place where a luxury department store could generate enormous profits. Lee Joon was the chairman of the Sampoong Group's construction division, a position that gave him significant resources and connections. He had built a business empire through a combination of shrewd investment and strategic relationships with government officials. When he looked at a plot of land in the Seocho district of Seoul, he didn't see a former landfill with questionable soil stability. He saw a prime location in one of Seoul's most affluent neighborhoods, a place where a luxury department store could generate enormous profits. The site had previously been used as a landfill, which engineering standards would typically flag as requiring extensive soil analysis and reinforced foundations. In the freewheeling construction culture of 1980s Seoul, however, such technical concerns could be, and often were, dismissed when financial incentives and political connections aligned. Lee Joon had the capital, the connections, and the determination to build something impressive on this spot, and the available evidence suggests he wasn't inclined to let geological complications interfere with his plans. The broader economic context made projects like Sampoong particularly attractive. South Korea's middle and upper classes were growing rapidly, and they had disposable income to spend on consumer goods. Department stores represented a relatively new retail format in Korea, offering a more upscale shopping experience than traditional markets. The success of early department stores had proven there was demand for this type of shopping environment, especially in wealthy areas like Gangnam. Gangnam itself was emblematic of the new South Korea. The area south of the Han River had been transformed from agricultural land into the most expensive real estate in the country. Luxury apartments, designer boutiques, and high-end restaurants catered to Seoul's newly wealthy. A large, prestigious department store in the heart of this district seemed like a can't-miss proposition. But the same forces that made the project attractive also made it dangerous. The pressure to build quickly and cheaply, the culture of cutting corners, the corrupt relationships between developers and officials, the prioritization of profit over safety. All of these factors would come together in the construction of Sampoong, creating a building that looked impressive from the outside, but was fundamentally unsound. The Sampoong story is often framed as the result of one man's greed and negligence, and while Lee Joon certainly bears enormous responsibility for what happened, the disaster was also a product of its time and place. It was the inevitable result of a construction culture that had lost sight of basic safety principles in the rush to build bigger, faster, and cheaper. It was the culmination of years of ignoring warning signs, of prioritizing economic growth over human life, of valuing appearance over substance. Other disasters had already provided warnings that something was seriously wrong with South Korea's construction practices. The Seongsu Bridge, which connected Seoul's Gangnam district to the rest of the city, had collapsed in October 1994, only 8 months before the Sampoong disaster. 32 people died and 17 were injured when a section of the bridge suddenly gave way during morning rush hour, sending vehicles plunging into the Han River below. The bridge collapse had sparked public outcry and prompted some discussion of construction safety, but not enough to prevent what was coming. The underlying issues, the corrupt relationships between developers and officials, the culture of cutting corners, the lack of meaningful oversight, all of these problems remained unaddressed. And so when Lee Joon began construction on his department store in 1987, all of the conditions were in place for another catastrophic failure. Part 3. A building doomed from the start. The story of the Sampoong Department Store's construction is a masterclass in how not to build anything, let alone a large commercial structure that would house thousands of people daily. From the initial planning stages through to the building's completion in 1989, virtually every decision made was wrong, and virtually every warning was ignored. Construction began in 1987, with the Sampoong Group breaking ground on what was originally planned as a 4-story residential apartment building. The project was assigned to Woosung Construction, a reputable firm that had been hired to handle both the construction and project supervision. The initial blueprints called for a straightforward residential structure with 4 floors above ground and 4 basement levels. The design included proper load-bearing columns, appropriate reinforcement, and structural elements suitable for the building's intended purpose. But Lee Joon had other plans. Midway through the construction process, he made a fateful decision to completely change the building's purpose. Instead of apartments, he wanted a department store. This wasn't a minor modification. It was a fundamental transformation that would require extensive changes to the building's structural design. Apartment buildings and department stores have very different requirements in terms of open floor space, load distribution, and structural support. To accommodate his new vision, Lee Joon demanded significant modifications to the existing blueprints. Support columns needed to be removed to create the open floor plans necessary for a retail environment. Walls had to be reconfigured. The entire internal structure had to be reimagined. Perhaps most critically, Lee Joon decided to add a fifth floor to the building, taking it beyond its original four-story design. The engineers at Woosung Construction immediately recognized the problems with these proposed changes. The building's foundation and structural framework had been designed for a four-story residential building, not a five-story commercial structure. Removing support columns would critically compromise the building's ability to bear its own weight. The load calculations would be entirely wrong. The whole plan was structurally unsound and potentially catastrophic. When the Woosung engineers raised these concerns and refused to implement the dangerous modifications, Lee Joon's response was swift and decisive. He fired Woosung Construction and hired his own company to complete the project. This move allowed him to circumvent the professional concerns of qualified engineers and instead impose his will on the construction process. Anyone who disagreed with his plans would simply be removed and replaced with someone more compliant. The new construction company proceeded to implement all of Lee Joon's modifications, despite their obvious structural problems. Support columns were removed to make way for escalators. The fifth floor was added, and it didn't stop there. Lee Joon continued to make changes as construction progressed, each one further compromising the building's integrity. The fifth floor itself underwent multiple transformations. Initially, it was supposed to be a roller skating rink. This designation was partly a way to circumvent zoning regulations that restricted pure retail development in the area. By classifying the fifth floor as recreational rather than commercial, Lee Joon could sidestep certain restrictions. But he later changed his mind again, deciding instead to install 8 traditional Korean restaurants on the top floor. This final change had serious structural implications. Traditional Korean restaurants use a floor heating system called ondol, which involves hot water pipes running through a thick concrete base. To accommodate this heating system, the fifth floor needed an unusually thick concrete foundation. Instead of a standard floor, the restaurants sat on concrete that was 1.2 meters thick, roughly 4 feet. This massively increased the weight that the building's structure would need to support. But the problems went far beyond just adding weight. The entire building was designed using what's called a flat slab structure. This type of construction doesn't use the crossbeams or steel skeleton that would normally help distribute loads across the building. Instead, each floor is essentially a flat concrete slab supported directly by columns. This can work if the columns are properly sized and spaced, but it leaves little margin for error. Lee Joon, in his quest to maximize open floor space for retail use, made another critical decision. He ordered that the diameter of the building's support columns be reduced from 80 centimeters to just 60 centimeters. That's a reduction from about 31 inches to 24 inches. This might not sound like much, but in structural engineering, such changes have enormous implications for load-bearing capacity. The reduced columns simply weren't adequate to support the weight they would eventually be asked to bear. To make matters worse, the spacing between columns was increased to 11 meters, about 36 feet. This maximized the amount of open floor space, but meant that each individual column had to support a much larger area of the floor above it. Fewer columns, each one undersized for its task, trying to hold up floors that were heavier than originally designed. It was a recipe for disaster. The construction company also used substandard materials. The steel reinforcing rods embedded in the concrete were thinner than building codes required. The concrete itself was of inferior quality. Every aspect of the construction cut corners, sacrificed safety for cost savings, and ignored basic engineering principles. As construction neared completion, Lee Joon made one final modification that would prove to be the proverbial last straw. He decided to install 3 large air conditioning units on the roof of the south wing. Each unit, when empty, weighed 15 tons. When filled with water and fully operational, they were even heavier. These units were designed to cool the entire building, and their weight far exceeded what the roof had been designed to support. The installation of these air conditioning units demonstrated the utter carelessness that characterized the entire project. Instead of using cranes and professional equipment movers to carefully position the units, workers simply dragged them across the roof to their final locations. This created tremendous stress on the roof surface, literally gouging cracks into the concrete as the heavy equipment scraped across it. The damage was immediately visible, but no one seemed concerned. The final structure was a catastrophe waiting to happen, built on a former landfill, designed for one purpose but used for another. Support columns removed and undersized. Floors made heavier than intended. Materials below code specifications. Massive weights added to a roof that couldn't support them. Every single element of the building's construction was wrong. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire construction process was how it was allowed to happen. Building inspectors were supposed to ensure that structures met safety codes. City officials were supposed to enforce regulations. Engineers were supposed to refuse to sign off on dangerous designs. But at every step, these safeguards failed. Corruption played a central role in this failure. Lee Joon used bribes to get his building approved despite its obvious deficiencies. City officials accepted payments to look the other way. Inspectors rubber-stamped paperwork without actually examining the structure. The entire regulatory system that was supposed to protect public safety had been compromised by greed. 12 local building officials would eventually be convicted of accepting bribes in connection with the Sampoong project. These weren't small payments. Some officials received as much as $17,000, a substantial sum in 1980s South Korea. In exchange, they approved modifications that any competent engineer would have recognized as dangerous. They issued permits for a building that never should have been allowed to open. When the building was finally completed in late 1989, it looked impressive from the outside. The distinctive pink facade gave it a cheerful, modern appearance. The spacious interior featured wide aisles, high ceilings, and an elegant atrium connecting the 2 wings. To the casual observer, it seemed like a perfectly normal, even upscale, department store. The building opened to the public on July 7, 1990. From the beginning, it was a commercial success. The location in affluent Gangnam attracted wealthy shoppers. The variety of stores and restaurants gave people reasons to spend hours browsing. Within weeks, the store was drawing an estimated 40,000 visitors per day. Revenue was strong. Lee Joon's gamble appeared to have paid off. But beneath the surface, the building was already showing signs of stress. Small cracks appeared in walls and ceilings. Floors sometimes made unsettling sounds. Vibrations from the air conditioning units could be felt throughout the upper floors. These were warning signs that something was wrong, but they were ignored or dismissed as minor issues. The building operated for nearly 5 years before its final catastrophic failure. During that time, it generated enormous profits for Lee Joon and the Sampoong Group. Thousands of people shopped there. Hundreds of employees worked there. It became a landmark, a destination, a symbol of Seoul's prosperity. And all the while, the structural deficiencies that had been built into its very foundation were slowly worsening. Cracks spreading, columns weakening, the building inexorably moving toward collapse. Part 4. The Warning Signs. The Sampoong Department Store didn't collapse without warning. In the months and weeks leading up to June 29, 1995, the building practically screamed that it was in distress. Cracks appeared and widened, floors sagged, strange sounds echoed through the structure. But at every turn, management chose to ignore these warnings, prioritizing profit over the safety of employees and customers. The first serious signs of trouble appeared in April 1995, about 2 months before the collapse. Cracks began forming in the ceiling of the 5th floor in the south wing, right where the 8 Korean restaurants were located. These weren't hairline fractures that might be dismissed as cosmetic issues. These were substantial cracks, the kind that should immediately trigger alarm in anyone who understands buildings. The restaurant staff noticed the cracks and reported them to management. The response revealed a troubling pattern. Instead of closing the floor for inspection or bringing in structural engineers to assess the situation, management simply moved merchandise and some equipment from the 5th floor down to the basement. The choice to relocate items while keeping the building operational suggests management recognized there was a problem serious enough to warrant moving valuable goods, yet not serious enough, in their judgment, to interrupt business operations. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorated. The cracks didn't just stay the same size, they grew. New cracks appeared. The ceiling began to sag visibly in certain areas. Water started leaking through the cracks. These were all clear indicators of structural failure in progress, yet the store remained fully operational. Employees who worked on the 5th floor became increasingly nervous. Some reported feeling the floor move beneath their feet. Others heard strange creaking and groaning sounds coming from the structure itself. These are the sounds a building makes when it's under stress, when structural elements are beginning to fail. But management continued to assure workers that everything was fine, that there was no danger, that they should just keep working. Then came June 29th, the day the building would finally fail. That morning, the situation went from concerning to critical. The cracks that had been slowly widening over the past 2 months suddenly began expanding rapidly. What had been inch-wide gaps in the concrete became gaping fissures several inches across. The ceiling of the 5th floor wasn't just sagging anymore. In some places, it was visibly bowing downward. Store employees who arrived for work that morning were immediately struck by how bad things looked. The cracks were no longer something you might miss if you weren't paying attention. They were obvious, alarming, impossible to ignore. Several employees approached management with their concerns. The building didn't feel safe. Something was clearly wrong. Shouldn't they close the store, at least temporarily, while engineers assessed the situation? Management's response was to close the 5th floor restaurants, but that was it. The rest of the store would remain open for business. After all, it was a Thursday, and Thursdays were typically busy shopping days. The number of customers in the building was unusually high. Closing the entire store would mean losing a day's revenue, and Lee Joon was not willing to accept that loss. By mid-morning, civil engineering experts were finally brought in to examine the structure. Their assessment was immediate and unequivocal. The building was in imminent danger of collapse. They recommended immediate evacuation and closure of the entire building. This wasn't a suggestion for some time in the future. They meant right now, immediately get everyone out. But Lee Joon, who had arrived at the store after being notified of the situation, looked at the packed floors of customers and made a fateful calculation. The engineer's warnings pointed to imminent danger, but his actions that day suggest he either didn't believe the severity of their assessment or prioritized financial considerations above evacuation. The store was generating substantial revenue, and every operational hour represented significant sales. Based on witness testimony from the trial, he decided the building would remain open. Around noon, in an attempt to reduce stress on the failing structure, management made the decision to shut off the building's air conditioning system. This is why customers and employees that day found themselves sweltering in the summer heat. The massive cooling units on the roof were turned off and the water was drained from them. This was meant to reduce both the weight and the vibrations stressing the roof. But it was far too little, far too late. The structural damage had been accumulating for years. The building had been doomed from the moment it was constructed, with undersized columns and removed supports. Turning off the air conditioning in the final hours wasn't going to save it. At about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, more ominous signs appeared. The fourth-floor ceiling, directly below the fifth-floor restaurants, was now sagging noticeably. The concrete was bowing downward under the enormous weight pressing on it from above. Management finally decided to close the fourth floor as well, but still kept the lower 3 floors and the basement levels open for business. 5 hours before the collapse, at around 1 in the afternoon, the first of several loud bangs echoed through the building. These weren't subtle sounds. They were sharp, explosive noises that startled customers and employees throughout the store. The sounds were support columns beginning to fail, concrete and steel giving way under stress they could no longer withstand. Each of these bangs should have triggered an immediate evacuation. But incredibly, management still did not order people to leave. Employees on the lower floors, who might not have fully understood how serious the situation was, continued working. Customers continued shopping. The store's PA system did not announce an evacuation. No alarms were sounded. Some employees, recognizing the danger, even without official instruction, began leaving on their own. They could hear the ominous sounds. They could feel something was terribly wrong. They trusted their instincts and got out. These people would survive. Others, following management's assurances that everything was under control, stayed at their posts. These would be the victims. Lee Joon himself, along with several other senior executives, left the building in the early afternoon. The timeline established through trial testimony shows they were present for the engineering assessment and departed shortly afterward. Yet no evacuation order was issued to employees or customers. The contrast between their departure and the continued operation of the store below became one of the most disturbing aspects of the disaster. Those with the authority to order an evacuation and ensure everyone's safe exit instead chose to leave without doing so. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the building was still operating. The lower floors were still full of customers. Employees were still at their registers and departments, and the structure was entering its final hour of existence. Witnesses later described hearing what sounded like small explosions or gunshots in the hour before the collapse. These were support columns failing one after another, the building's structural system beginning a cascading failure that would soon become catastrophic. Each failing column transferred more stress to the remaining columns, which were already inadequate for the loads they were bearing. At 5:47, just 10 minutes before the collapse, workers throughout the building heard a sound unlike anything before, a deep, resonant groan that seemed to come from the building itself. The structure was screaming its distress. Some people finally understood that they needed to get out immediately. A rush toward exits began, but for most of the 1,500 people still in the building, there simply wasn't enough time. At 5:50 in the evening, alarms finally began sounding throughout the store. Automated fire alarms had been triggered by the building's movements. A recorded announcement told people to evacuate immediately. But the warning came just 7 minutes before the building would collapse. 7 minutes for 1,500 people to realize the danger, stop what they were doing, and make it to exits and downstairs to safety. It wasn't enough time. Not nearly enough. Part 5. 20 Seconds of Hell. 5:57 on the evening of June 29, 1995. For 1,500 people inside the Sampoong Department Store, the world was about to end in the most terrifying way imaginable. The collapse didn't begin with a single catastrophic failure. It was the culmination of a cascade that had been building for the past several hours, indeed for the past several years. But when the final failure came, it was sudden, violent, and complete. The initiating event was the complete separation of Column 5E from the fifth-floor slab. This column, located in the center of the south wing, had been showing signs of critical stress for hours. The cracks at its base had widened throughout the day. The concrete had been crumbling. And now, at 5:57, it finally gave way completely. When a support column fails in a flat slab structure like Sampoong, the results are catastrophic. Without the column to support it, the concrete slab above begins to fall. But it doesn't fall cleanly. The concrete around where the column was attached experiences what engineers call punching shear failure. Essentially, the column punches through the floor slab like a fist through paper. The moment column 5E failed, the portion of the fifth floor it had been supporting dropped. This wasn't a slow settling. It was a sudden, violent drop of several feet. The impact sent shockwaves through the rest of the structure, and more critically, it transferred all of the weight that column 5E had been carrying onto the surrounding columns. Those surrounding columns were already operating at or beyond their design capacity. They were undersized for their task. They had been weakened by years of stress and by the constant vibration from the air conditioning units. Now suddenly, they were being asked to support not just their original load, but the additional load from the failed column. They couldn't do it. Within seconds, these columns also began to fail. As each one gave way, it transferred its load to the next column, creating a cascading failure that rippled outward from the initial failure point. It was like watching dominoes fall, except each domino was a massive concrete column, and each fall dropped another section of floor. The fifth floor collapsed first, dropping into the fourth floor. The combined weight of both floors, along with the momentum of the falling concrete, was more than the fourth floor could bear. It failed almost instantly, collapsing onto the third floor. Then the third floor gave way, dropping into the second, then the second into the first. Each floor pancaking onto the one below in rapid succession. The entire process took approximately 20 seconds from the initial column failure to the final settling of debris in the basement. 20 seconds during which 5 floors of reinforced concrete, steel, furniture, fixtures, merchandise, and most horrifyingly, people collapsed in a progressive implosion. Survivors who made it out would later describe the sound as unlike anything they had ever experienced. A deafening roar that combined the cracking of concrete, the screaming of twisted metal, the explosion of shattering glass, and the desperate screams of those caught in the collapse. The noise was so loud that it could be heard blocks away, drawing people out of their homes and businesses to see what had happened. The collapse was visible from outside the building. Witnesses watched in horror as the center of the south wing simply dropped, the floors pancaking down into the basement in a massive cloud of dust and debris. The pink exterior walls initially remained standing, creating the surreal image of a building facade with nothing behind it. Then these too began to crumble and fall. Inside the building, for those who survived the initial collapse, the experience was nightmarish. The world literally fell out from under them. Everything that had been solid became chaos. The lights went out immediately. The air filled with choking dust. The sounds of screaming and the groaning of settling debris filled the darkness. Choi Myeong-seok, who had been on one of the lower floors, later described the experience. One moment he was going about his business. The next, the floor dropped beneath him and everything went dark. He felt himself falling, surrounded by debris and dust. When the movement stopped and he could think again, he found himself pinned in a small pocket of space, surrounded by concrete and twisted metal, unable to see anything in the complete darkness. For Park Seung-hyun, working in the children's department in the first basement level, the collapse came as a sudden, violent impact from above. The ceiling came down on the floor she was standing on. She was buried instantly under concrete and debris, trapped in a space so small she could barely move. In the pitch darkness, unable to see anything, feeling crushing weight all around her, she had no way of knowing if she would survive the next few seconds, let alone the next few days. Yoo Ji-hwan was in a similarly terrifying situation. The collapse buried her in the basement level, creating a tiny survival pocket where she lay surrounded by debris. In the immediate aftermath, she could hear other people nearby, fellow employees who had been buried alongside her. They called out to each other in the darkness, trying to maintain hope, trying to stay calm, trying to believe that rescue would come. Outside, in the minutes immediately following the collapse, there was initially stunned silence from the crowds that had gathered. People couldn't quite process what they were seeing. A major building, a landmark, a place where thousands shopped daily, had simply ceased to exist. In its place was a massive pile of rubble and dust, a crater where the south wing had been. Then the screaming started. Not from inside the rubble, though there was certainly plenty of that, but from the crowds outside. People who had family members shopping in the store, employees' relatives waiting to pick them up after their shifts, passers-by, who realized they were witnessing a major catastrophe with hundreds of people buried alive. The first emergency calls went out within a minute of the collapse. The Seoul Fire Department received multiple simultaneous reports of a building collapse at the Sampoong Department Store. The scale wasn't immediately clear from these initial reports. A building collapse could mean anything from a partial wall failure to what actually occurred. But as more calls came in, all describing the same massive collapse, dispatchers began to understand they were dealing with a major disaster. The first fire engines and ambulances arrived on the scene within 10 minutes of the collapse. What they found was a scene of utter devastation. The entire center section of the south wing had collapsed into the basement, creating a crater roughly 100 meters long and spanning all 5 floors. The remaining structure was unstable, with walls and floors threatening to collapse at any moment. Dust filled the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. And somewhere in that massive pile of concrete, steel, and debris were approximately 1,500 people, dead or alive. The immediate priority was to begin searching for survivors. Firefighters and emergency workers began carefully picking through the rubble near the edges of the collapse, looking for anyone who might have survived in air pockets or spaces between the slabs. Every movement had to be careful. The remaining structure was unstable. Any disturbance could trigger further collapse that would kill both survivors and rescuers. In the first hours, rescuers pulled out dozens of survivors from near the edges of the collapsed area. These were the lucky ones who had been near exits when the building came down, or who had been on the periphery of the collapse zone and ended up buried under less debris. Many were injured, some critically, but they were alive. Each rescue gave hope that more survivors might be found deeper in the rubble. But as the hours passed and night fell, the true scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a collapse with a few dozen casualties. This was a catastrophe that had killed hundreds. The vast majority of the 1,500 people who had been in the building when it collapsed was still buried in the rubble, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding them alive grew smaller. The collapse of the Sampoong Department Store would ultimately be recorded as the deadliest peacetime building disaster in South Korean history. 502 people died. 937 were injured, many critically. 6 people were never found, their bodies presumably pulverized by the immense forces of the collapse or buried so deep in the rubble that they couldn't be recovered. But in those first hours after the collapse, the full death toll was unknown. All anyone knew was that something terrible had happened, that hundreds of people were trapped, and that time was running out to save them. Part 6. The First Hours, Chaos and Heroism. The immediate aftermath of the Sampoong Department Store collapse was characterized by chaos, confusion, and remarkable acts of bravery by ordinary people who rushed to help. In the hours before organized rescue operations could be fully established, it was these volunteers, neighbors, and passers-by who saved many of the lives that would be saved. The collapse occurred at 5:57 in the evening, during the busy hours when many people were still out and about in Gangnam. The sound of the collapse, that terrible roar of failing concrete and steel, drew people from blocks around. Within minutes, hundreds of civilians had gathered at the site, and many immediately began trying to help. These early volunteers didn't have proper equipment, training, or coordination. What they had was courage and desperation. Many had family members or friends who worked at or shopped at Sampoong. Others were simply moved by the cries for help coming from the rubble. They began pulling away chunks of concrete and twisted metal with their bare hands, calling out to anyone who might be buried and listening for responses. The scene was incredibly dangerous. The remaining structure was unstable, with portions of walls and floors threatening to collapse at any moment. Electrical wires hung loose and live from the wreckage, posing electrocution hazards. Gas leaks created the risk of explosion. Sharp edges of broken concrete and twisted rebar were everywhere. But none of this deterred the volunteers who climbed over and into the rubble despite the dangers. In these first chaotic hours, many survivors were pulled from the debris by these civilian rescuers. People who were near the edges of the collapse zone, who were conscious and able to call out, were located and extracted. Some were relatively uninjured, shocked but mobile. Others had been crushed or trapped by debris and needed multiple people working together to free them. The volunteers formed human chains, passing chunks of concrete hand to hand to clear paths to trapped survivors. One particularly dramatic rescue involved a woman who was trapped under a large concrete slab with only her head and one arm visible. Volunteers worked frantically to dig around her, removing smaller pieces of debris while trying to figure out how to lift or break the slab that pinned her. They knew that moving the slab wrong could shift other debris and kill her or others who might be nearby. After nearly an hour of careful work, they managed to create enough space to pull her free. She had multiple broken bones and internal injuries, but was alive. The first emergency responders, fire trucks and ambulances from nearby stations, began arriving within 10 to 15 minutes of the collapse, but they faced immediate challenges. The narrow streets of the Gangnam district were quickly clogged with traffic as people tried to flee the area or come to help. Emergency vehicles struggled to get through. When they did arrive, they found a scene that was overwhelming in scale. The Seoul Fire Department was equipped to handle normal emergencies, apartment fires, car accidents, the occasional industrial incident. They were not prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. They didn't have enough equipment, enough personnel, or established protocols for something like this. The reality was that South Korea in 1995 had never experienced a building collapse on this scale and simply wasn't ready for it. In the first hours, rescue efforts were uncoordinated. Different fire stations and police precincts responded, but there was no unified command structure directing the overall effort. Multiple groups of rescuers worked in different areas of the collapse zone, sometimes getting in each other's way. There was no clear system for marking areas that had been searched or for tracking who had been rescued and where they had been taken. The lack of proper equipment was also a critical problem. Rescuers needed heavy machinery, cranes to lift large pieces of concrete, excavators to dig through debris, cutting equipment to get through steel reinforcement. But bringing such equipment to the site took time. It had to be transported from construction sites or equipment yards. Operators had to be located and brought to the scene. And even when the equipment arrived, it had to be used carefully because of the risk of causing further collapse or crushing survivors who might be buried nearby. Medical response was similarly chaotic. Injured survivors pulled from the rubble needed immediate medical attention, but the sheer number of casualties overwhelmed the available ambulances and nearby hospitals. There was no established triage system to prioritize the most critical cases. Injured people were taken to whichever hospital was closest or had the first available ambulance, rather than being distributed based on the severity of their injuries and the capabilities of different hospitals. Family members of people who had been in the store began arriving at the scene, desperately seeking information about their loved ones. But there was no organized system for providing information or for matching survivors with family. Some people wandered through the crowd of evacuees, hoping to spot a familiar face. Others went from hospital to hospital, checking emergency rooms. Still others simply stood at the edge of the rubble, calling out names and hoping for a response. As night fell, floodlights were brought in to illuminate the collapsed site, creating an eerie scene of long shadows and harsh light. The work continued through the night, but it was becoming clear that most of the people still buried were probably dead. The ones who had survived the initial collapse and were accessible had mostly been reached in the first few hours. Those still buried were either dead or trapped so deeply that reaching them would take days. Around midnight, approximately 6 hours after the collapse, Seoul's mayor, Choi Myeong-seok, arrived at the scene. After consulting with fire officials and engineers, he made a controversial announcement. The rescue operation would be called off due to concerns that the unstable remains of the building could collapse further, endangering rescue workers. The announcement triggered immediate and intense backlash. Family members of the missing surrounded the mayor and city officials, demanding that rescue efforts continue. How could they give up when there might still be people alive in the rubble? The mayor tried to explain the safety concerns, that the risk of the remaining structure collapsing was very real, and that continuing rescue efforts could result in rescue workers being killed. But to the desperate families, this sounded like the authorities were abandoning their loved ones. The protest grew larger and more heated. Media coverage of the mayor's decision to halt rescue efforts sparked public outrage across Seoul and indeed across the country. Protesters began gathering at the site, refusing to leave, demanding that rescue operations continue regardless of the danger. The combination of media pressure and public anger forced city officials to reverse the decision. After several hours of protests, the mayor announced that rescue efforts would continue, but with extra precautions to try to stabilize the remaining structure. Engineering teams worked through the night to assess the stability of what was left standing and to devise ways to stabilize it. They brought in steel cables and supports to brace unstable walls. They carefully removed portions of the structure that seemed most likely to collapse, trying to make the site safer for rescue workers to operate in. By dawn on June 30th, a more organized rescue operation was beginning to take shape. Additional heavy equipment had arrived. A command structure had been established with clear chains of authority. Search areas were being systematically mapped and assigned to different rescue teams. Medical triage was being set up at the site so the most critical patients could be prioritized for transport. The chaos of the first night was being replaced with something more organized, though the scale of the disaster meant conditions were still far from ideal. But the hard reality was setting in. Most of the people who were going to be found alive had already been found. Those still buried were almost certainly dead, or buried so deep that they wouldn't be reached for days or even weeks. The operation was shifting from rescue to recovery, though no one was ready to admit it yet. As long as there was any possibility of finding someone alive, the workers would keep searching. And remarkably, against all odds, they would indeed find survivors even days and weeks after the collapse. People who had been buried alive, trapped in tiny pockets of space, surviving without food and with only rainwater to drink, somehow managing to hold on until rescuers could reach them. Their stories would become symbols of hope and human resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. Part 7. Days in Darkness. The Long Rescue. As the hours stretched into days following the Sampoong Department Store collapse, the rescue operation transformed into a race against time. Every hour that passed decreased the chances that anyone still buried could survive. Yet rescue workers continued to find survivors, even several days after the collapse, in what can only be described as miraculous circumstances. The second day of rescue operations, June 30th, brought both hope and heartbreak. Teams of workers continued carefully excavating through the massive pile of debris, using a combination of heavy machinery for the larger pieces and hand tools for more delicate work when they suspected someone might be nearby. Every few hours, another survivor would be located and pulled from the rubble. Their rescue met with cheers from workers and families gathered at the site. But for every survivor found, many more bodies were recovered. The true scale of the disaster was becoming horrifyingly apparent. Entire sections of the building had pancaked so completely that there were no survival spaces, just layers of compressed concrete with the crushed remains of what had been on each floor. Rescue workers, many of whom were volunteers with no training for dealing with such gruesome scenes, were traumatized by what they found. The heat was oppressive. Seoul in late June is hot and humid, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the rescue workers as they labored in heavy protective gear. The smell from the rubble was becoming increasingly unbearable, a combination of building materials, leaking chemicals, and decomposing bodies. Workers had to take frequent breaks to avoid heat exhaustion and to cope with the emotional toll of the recovery effort. One of the significant challenges facing rescuers was the sheer instability of the rubble pile. The collapsed structure wasn't a stable mass. It was a chaotic assemblage of concrete slabs, steel beams, and other building materials delicately balanced against each other. Moving one piece could trigger a cascade that would bury survivors or kill rescue workers. Engineers had to constantly assess the stability and direct where excavation could safely proceed. On July 1st, 3 days after the collapse, rescue workers made contact with a group of survivors trapped together in a pocket of space in the basement. Through a small opening, they could communicate with the trapped people, who were alive but in bad condition. The problem was that reaching them required removing a massive concrete slab that was precariously balanced. Moving it wrong could crush the very people they were trying to save. For hours, engineers debated the best approach. Heavy machinery couldn't be used because the vibration might trigger a collapse. Hand tools would take too long, and the trapped people were already severely dehydrated. Finally, they decided to carefully drill through the slab to create an opening large enough to pull people through. The drilling process took most of the day, every moment agonizing for the trapped survivors and their families watching from behind barriers. When the opening was finally complete, rescue workers began pulling people out one by one. 5 people were extracted alive from that space, 4 of them in serious condition. One elderly woman died shortly after being pulled out, her body simply unable to recover from the trauma and dehydration. But 4 more survivors had been saved, and each rescue sustained the hope that others might still be found. Communications with potentially trapped survivors became a key part of the rescue effort. Workers would periodically stop all machinery and call for silence, then shout into the rubble or use listening devices, hoping to hear a response. Several times, they made contact with people who were alive but couldn't be immediately reached. These situations were agonizing for everyone involved. Knowing someone was alive but being unable to rescue them immediately was deeply frustrating. Korea Telecom set up a system where they would transmit a signal every half hour, designed to trigger any cell phones or pagers that trapped survivors might be carrying. The idea was that rescuers could listen for these devices going off and use the sound to locate buried victims. While this technology helped in a few cases, it was limited by the fact that cellular phones were not as common in 1995 as they would become in later years, and many phones' batteries were dead by this point anyway. As the days progressed, the operation increasingly shifted from rescue to recovery. By July 2nd, 4 days after the collapse, city officials were publicly stating that anyone still in the building was likely dead, and that the focus should be on recovering bodies rather than searching for survivors. However, workers continued to search thoroughly, knowing that giving up too soon could mean abandoning people who were still clinging to life. Conditions for those trapped in the rubble were almost unimaginably harsh. Complete darkness, crushing confinement, no food. The only water was rainwater that trickled down through cracks in the debris. The psychological toll of being buried alive, not knowing if rescue would come, was immense. Many who were pulled out alive described the experience as a constant battle against despair, trying to maintain hope even as hours stretched into days. Choi Myeong-seok, who was trapped for 10 days before being rescued, later described his experience in interviews. He had been pinned in a small space, unable to move much, but not badly injured. In the complete darkness, his mind played tricks on him. He heard sounds and couldn't tell if they were rescuers working nearby or just the settling of the debris. From his accounts, we can infer that conserving energy and oxygen became paramount concerns. Time lost meaning in the darkness. The cycle of day and night became impossible to track. According to his testimony, Choi's focus narrowed to the most elemental aspects of survival. Each breath, occasional sips of rainwater when it trickled down, maintaining consciousness. His later interviews suggest he spent considerable time thinking about his family, wondering about their search efforts, and making mental commitments about how he would approach life if he made it out. When he finally heard voices that he was certain were rescuers, not just his imagination, he used the last of his strength to make noise, banging on the concrete around him to help them locate him. When light finally broke through and he saw human faces, he could barely process that he was actually being rescued. 10 days of darkness and isolation had left him disoriented and overwhelmed. He was severely dehydrated and had lost 11 pounds, but against all odds, he was alive. Yoo Ji-hwan had a similar ordeal, trapped for 12 days in a space so small she could barely move. Only 18 years old, she survived in a tiny pocket measuring just 4.5 feet long and 19 inches wide. She was sustained entirely by rainwater that dripped down to her location. When rescuers finally reached her on July 11th, nearly 2 weeks after the collapse, she was remarkably coherent and in relatively good physical condition, considering her ordeal, though severely dehydrated and with minor injuries to her leg. The rescue workers were amazed by her survival. 12 days trapped in the rubble, with no food and only rainwater to drink, should have killed her. The fact that she was found alive and alert gave everyone involved in the rescue operation renewed energy and hope. If someone could survive 12 days, maybe others were still alive deeper in the rubble. The search continued with renewed intensity, but the most remarkable survival story was yet to come. On July 16th, 17 days after the collapse, rescue workers were systematically clearing one of the last sections of the basement when they heard something. A faint sound, possibly human. They stopped all equipment and listened. There it was again. Someone was alive down there. The rescue team worked frantically but carefully, removing debris piece by piece, constantly talking to the trapped person to reassure them and to gauge their location. As they got closer, they could make out a female voice. She was conscious, able to respond to questions. After hours of painstaking excavation, they created an opening and saw a young woman looking back at them. It was Park Seung-hyun, the 19-year-old store clerk who had been working in the children's department when the building collapsed. She had been trapped for 17 days in the darkness, buried under massive amounts of concrete and debris. She had survived by drinking rainwater that trickled down to her small survival space and by sheer force of will. When rescuers pulled her out, she was wrapped in a blanket, having lost the clothes she had been wearing. She was severely dehydrated and malnourished, but astonishingly, she had no major injuries. Just 17 days buried alive, and she walked out of that hellhole alive. Her rescue was broadcast on television across South Korea and became an international news story. She represented hope, resilience, the possibility of survival against impossible odds. Park Seung-hyun would be the last person pulled alive from the rubble of Sampoong Department Store. Her rescue on the 17th day marked an extraordinary end to one of the most intensive rescue operations in South Korean history. In total, approximately 392 people were pulled from the wreckage alive, though many died later from their injuries, bringing the final death toll to 502. The stories of the long-term survivors like Choi, Yoo, and Park captured public imagination and provided some measure of hope and redemption in an otherwise horrific disaster. Their survival demonstrated the resilience of the human body and spirit, but their experiences also highlighted the randomness and cruelty of the disaster. Why did these three survive when 500 others didn't? It came down to pure chance, to being in the right spot when the building collapsed, to ending up in one of the few spaces that didn't completely close off, to being fortunate enough to have rainwater reach them. Many survivors struggled with guilt and trauma after their rescue. They had survived while co-workers and friends had died. Some developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder. The psychological toll of being buried alive, of believing you were going to die, of hearing others around you dying, was immense and lasting. Support systems for disaster survivors were limited in South Korea at the time, and many victims received inadequate mental health care in the aftermath. The rescue operation formally concluded in late July, more than 3 weeks after the collapse. The recovery of bodies continued for weeks beyond that. In total, the operation had involved thousands of workers, both professional rescuers and volunteers. Heavy equipment from across Seoul had been mobilized. The estimated cost of the rescue and recovery operation ran into the millions of dollars. But no amount of money or effort could bring back the 502 people who died, or the 6 whose bodies were never recovered. The Sampoong Department Store disaster had ended, but its impact on South Korean society was just beginning to be understood. Part 8. Investigation and Justice. Even as rescue operations continued in the days following the Sampoong collapse, investigations into what caused the disaster and who was responsible were already underway. The Seoul District Prosecutor's Office took the lead, assembling a team of investigators, engineers, and forensic experts to examine every aspect of the building's construction and the decisions that led to the collapse. The investigation was exhaustive, eventually producing a comprehensive report titled The Final White Book of Finding Out the Real Truth of the Collapse of the Sampoong Department Store. This document, running hundreds of pages, meticulously detailed the structural failures, the construction shortcuts, the corrupt relationships, and the decisions on June 29th that led to such massive loss of life. The structural analysis revealed what many engineers had suspected from the beginning. The building had been doomed from its conception. The investigators confirmed that the original design had been fundamentally compromised by Lee Joon's modifications. The support columns, reduced from 80 centimeters to 60 centimeters in diameter, were simply inadequate for the loads they needed to bear. The removal of support columns to make room for escalators had critically weakened the structure. The addition of the fifth floor had added weight the building wasn't designed to support. But the most damning findings concerned the building's flat slab construction and the loads it was subjected to. Engineers calculated that the fifth floor was bearing approximately 4 times its intended design load. The heavy ondol heating system in the restaurants, the thick concrete floor, and especially the 3 massive air conditioning units on the roof had pushed the structure far beyond its capacity. The investigators also confirmed that the air conditioning units had been negligently installed. Instead of being properly lifted into place by cranes, they had been dragged across the roof, creating significant damage. The vibrations from these units, when operational, had transmitted stress throughout the building, gradually widening existing cracks and weakening already compromised columns. Turning off the air conditioning on the day of the collapse was an attempt to reduce this stress, but by then, the damage was far too extensive for such a measure to matter. The forensic analysis of the rubble provided detailed information about the collapse sequence. The investigators confirmed that column 5E had been the initiating failure point. This column, located centrally in the 5th floor of the south wing, had completely separated from the floor slab it was supporting. The punching shear failure at this column triggered the progressive collapse that brought down the entire center section of the south wing in about 20 seconds. Material testing revealed another layer of negligence. The concrete and steel used in construction were below specifications. The concrete was weaker than it should have been, suggesting either inferior materials or improper mixing and curing. The steel reinforcement bars were thinner than building codes required. Every aspect of the actual construction cut corners and sacrificed safety for cost savings. But the investigation went beyond just the structural failures. Prosecutors delved into the corrupt relationships that had allowed such a dangerous building to be approved and operated. They examined financial records, interviewed city officials, and traced the bribes that had been paid to allow the building's illegal modifications to proceed. What they found was a web of corruption involving Lee Joon, his son Lee Han-sung, who served as the company's president, and at least 12 city officials responsible for building inspection and approval. These officials had accepted bribes totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases as much as $17,000 to individual officials, to approve modifications and provide certificates that the building met safety standards. The investigation also examined the events of June 29th and the decisions made by building management as warning signs became increasingly dire. Testimony from survivors and analysis of security footage revealed that Lee Joon and other senior executives had been informed multiple times throughout the day that engineers believed the building was in imminent danger of collapse. Despite these warnings, Lee Joon made the decision to keep the store open. Trial testimony from employees and managers revealed that discussions throughout the day repeatedly returned to the potential revenue loss from closing on a busy Thursday. Even when engineers explicitly recommended immediate evacuation, management resisted, initially closing only the most obviously dangerous floors while keeping the rest of the building operational. The pattern of decision-making that day suggests financial considerations weighed heavily in the response to the engineering warnings. Perhaps most damningly, the investigation revealed that Lee Joon and several other senior executives had left the building in the early afternoon, well before the collapse. They knew the danger was serious enough that they didn't want to be in the building, but they didn't order an evacuation or even inform employees and customers about the risk. They saved themselves and left everyone else behind. This revelation caused enormous public outrage when it became known. The image of wealthy executives fleeing a building they knew was about to collapse, while leaving 1,500 other people inside, became a symbol of the callous greed and disregard for human life that characterized the disaster. The public response to the investigation's findings was swift and furious. Mass protests erupted across Seoul, with thousands of people taking to the streets demanding justice for the victims. The disaster had shaken public confidence, not just in the Sampoong Group, but in the entire construction industry and the government officials responsible for oversight. A broader investigation into construction practices across Seoul revealed just how widespread the problems were. A government survey of high-rise buildings in the city found that 14% were structurally unsafe and needed to be completely rebuilt. 84% required significant repairs to meet basic safety standards. Only 2% of buildings surveyed were found to fully meet codes and government safety standards. These findings were shocking, but not entirely surprising. The construction boom of the 80s and early 90s had prioritized speed and profit over safety. The results were buildings that might look impressive from the outside, but were fundamentally unsound. The Sampoong collapse had been the most dramatic failure, but investigators now understood it was just the most visible example of systemic problems. On December 27, 1995, 6 months after the collapse, the first verdicts came down. Lee Joon was convicted of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10 years and 6 months in prison. This would later be reduced, on appeal, to 7 years and 6 months. His son, Lee Joon, was convicted of corruption and accidental homicide and sentenced to 7 years. The 12 city officials who had accepted bribes were also convicted and sentenced to various terms. These sentences ranged from 3 to 7 years, depending on the extent of their involvement and the amounts of money they had accepted. Several were also ordered to pay substantial fines. Public reaction to the sentences was mixed. Many felt that even the longest sentences were inadequate given the scale of the tragedy. 7.5 years in prison for 502 deaths seemed woefully insufficient. Others noted that at least in this case, unlike many cases of corporate malfeasance, those responsible were actually being held accountable and sent to prison. In addition to the criminal proceedings, civil cases were filed by victims' families and survivors seeking compensation. 2 months after the collapse, Lee Joon and his son submitted a jointly signed memorandum to the city of Seoul, offering their entire wealth to compensate the families of victims. This wasn't just a gesture. The Sampoong Group ceased to exist as a business entity. The compensation settlement ultimately involved 3,293 separate cases, with total payouts amounting to approximately 375 billion won, roughly $300 million. These payments were distributed to victims' families and survivors over several years, with all payouts completed by 2003. For many families, no amount of money could compensate for the loss of a loved one or the trauma of survival. But the comprehensive compensation program was at least an acknowledgement of responsibility and an attempt at making amends, something that victims of corporate disasters often struggle to obtain. Lee Joon served most of his sentence, being released in 2002. He was reported to be in poor health following his release and died a few years later. His son served his full sentence and subsequently maintained a low profile, the family's business empire having been dismantled to pay compensation to victims. The legal proceedings and their outcomes sent a clear message. Those responsible for the disaster would be held accountable. This represented something of a departure from the past, when corporate leaders often escaped serious consequences for negligence that resulted in loss of life. Part 9. Reform and Legacy. The Sampoong Department Store collapse served as a catalyst for sweeping changes in South Korea's construction industry, building codes, and disaster response capabilities. The disaster had exposed such fundamental failures in the system that the status quo was no longer tenable. Public pressure and governmental embarrassment combined to force genuine reforms. In the immediate aftermath, the South Korean government launched a comprehensive review of building safety regulations. A special task force was assembled to examine existing building codes, identify gaps and weaknesses, and propose strengthened standards. The goal was to ensure that another disaster on the scale of Sampoong could never happen again. The resulting reforms touched every aspect of building design, construction, and oversight. New regulations required independent structural reviews whenever significant design changes were proposed during construction. No longer could a developer simply fire one construction company and hire another, more compliant one to implement dangerous modifications. Any major changes to approved plans now required re-evaluation by independent engineers who had no financial relationship with the project. Column specifications and load-bearing requirements were strengthened, particularly for flat slab structures like Sampoong. The new codes required larger columns with more spacing restrictions to ensure adequate support. The use of flat slab construction without proper reinforcement was essentially banned for large commercial structures. Building inspection procedures were overhauled. Instead of relying primarily on initial approval with minimal ongoing oversight, the new system required periodic inspections throughout construction and random audits of completed buildings. Inspectors were given more training and resources, and penalties for accepting bribes or falsifying inspection reports were dramatically increased. The government also established new disaster response protocols. The chaos of the first hours after the Sampoong collapse, with no unified command structure and inadequate equipment, had demonstrated the need for better preparation. New emergency management systems were developed specifically for large-scale disasters, with clear chains of command, pre-designated staging areas, and stockpiles of specialized rescue equipment. The disaster also revealed deficiencies in emergency medical response. The lack of triage systems and the chaotic distribution of injured patients to hospitals had hampered effective medical care. In response, South Korea developed one of the world's most advanced disaster medicine protocols, including specialized trauma centers, helicopter transport systems, and comprehensive triage procedures. Beyond the technical reforms, the Sampoong disaster prompted a broader cultural reckoning about the costs of rapid development. The notion that economic growth should take precedence over safety and human welfare was increasingly questioned. The disaster became a cautionary tale used in business schools, engineering programs, and government training to illustrate the consequences of prioritizing profit over responsibility. The construction industry itself underwent significant changes. Many companies that had been operating with questionable safety practices found themselves under increased scrutiny. Some were forced out of business when their buildings were found to be structurally unsound. Others reformed their practices to comply with the new, stricter standards. The industry as a whole became more professional and safety-conscious, though problems certainly didn't disappear entirely. The question of memorializing the disaster and remembering its victims became controversial. Families of the deceased wanted a memorial built on the site where Sampoong had stood, a place where they could gather to honor their loved ones. However, this proposal faced opposition from local politicians and real estate interests who argued that the land, located in one of Seoul's most expensive districts, was too valuable to be used for a memorial. This dispute revealed continuing tensions between commercial interests and public memory. After extended negotiations, a compromise was reached. A memorial would be built, but not on the Sampoong site itself. Instead, the memorial was erected in Yangjae Citizens Forest, a park located approximately 4 kilometers from where the disaster occurred. The memorial, designed by Ua Women's University professor and sculptor Kim Bong-gu, stands 12 meters high and is made of marble. It was funded by the Sampoong Group as part of their compensation to victims. The design incorporates symbolic elements representing both the tragedy and the hope for prevention of future disasters. Each year on June 29th, bereaved families gather at this memorial for a ceremony remembering those who died. The land where Sampoong Department Store once stood was sold to a private developer. In 2001, construction began on a luxury apartment complex called Acrovista, which was completed in 2004. Walking through the area today, there is no visible sign that a disaster killing over 500 people occurred here. The gleaming apartment towers, home to some of Seoul's wealthiest residents, have completely erased the physical traces of the tragedy. This erasure has been criticized by some as emblematic of a broader tendency to forget uncomfortable aspects of the past in favor of presenting an image of progress and prosperity. The fact that a former president of South Korea, Yoon Suk Yeol, lived in one of these apartments before moving to the presidential residence only reinforced this sense that the tragedy had been paved over and forgotten by those in power. But for the families of victims and survivors, the memory remains vivid and painful. Studies conducted years after the disaster found that many survivors continued to struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. A survey done on the 30th anniversary of the collapse found that 19 of 30 bereaved family members surveyed were still suffering from what psychologists categorized as post-traumatic embitterment disorder, a pathological reaction to negative life events characterized by feelings of injustice and helplessness. The psychological impact of the disaster extended beyond direct victims and their families. The collapse had inflicted collective trauma on South Korean society. Coming just 8 months after the Seongsu Bridge collapse, Sampoong seemed to confirm fears that the rapid development of the previous decades had been built on dangerously shaky foundations. People began to question whether the buildings they worked in, the bridges they drove over, the stores they shopped in, were actually safe. This broader loss of trust in institutions and infrastructure was perhaps one of the disaster's most significant social impacts. It represented a coming of age for South Korean society, a recognition that economic prosperity meant nothing if it came at the cost of basic safety and human life. The hustle culture that had driven the nation's remarkable development was increasingly seen as having a dark side that needed to be acknowledged and addressed. The Sampoong disaster has been extensively studied by engineers, architects, disaster management professionals, and social scientists. It appears in textbooks and case studies around the world as an example of how corruption, negligence, and flawed engineering can combine to create catastrophe. The technical details of the collapse have been analyzed to understand failure modes and improve building design. The social and organizational failures have been examined to improve oversight systems and corporate governance. In South Korea itself, the disaster lives on in popular culture. Songs, films, novels, and television programs have explored the tragedy from various angles. Rock band NEXT released a song in 1995 called "The World We Made" that reflected on the disaster and the society that produced it. The lyrics asked who should be blamed and suggested that everyone was complicit in creating a world where such disasters could occur. More recently, documentaries and dramatic series have revisited the disaster, interviewing survivors and examining the circumstances that led to the collapse. These cultural productions serve to keep the memory alive and to remind new generations of the costs of negligence and corruption. They ensure that Sampoong remains a living memory rather than just a historical footnote. The reforms prompted by the Sampoong disaster have undoubtedly saved lives. South Korea's building codes are now among the most stringent in the world. The country's disaster response capabilities are highly developed. While problems certainly still exist in the construction industry, nothing on the scale of Sampoong has occurred in the 3 decades since. Yet questions remain about whether the lessons have been fully learned. Periodic scandals involving shoddy construction, bribery of building inspectors, and inadequate safety enforcement suggest that some of the underlying problems persist. Rapid development continues to be valued, and economic pressures can still lead to corner-cutting. The challenge is maintaining vigilance and commitment to safety, even as the memory of the disaster fades. Part 10: The Human Cost. Beyond the statistics of 502 dead and 937 injured, the Sampoong Department Store collapse represents hundreds of individual tragedies, each one a life cut short or forever changed by negligence and greed. To understand the true impact of the disaster, we need to remember that these weren't just numbers. They were people with families, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them. Among the dead were store clerks, many of them young women in their late teens or early 20s working their first jobs. They were saving money for college, helping support their families, learning about responsibility and independence. They showed up for work on June 29th like any other day, expecting to spend their shift helping customers, restocking shelves, processing sales. They never went home. Restaurant workers on the 5th floor, many of them skilled cooks and servers who took pride in their craft, were going about their preparations for the evening dinner service when the building collapsed. Some were cooking, others were setting tables, preparing for the customers who would never arrive. The 8 restaurants on that floor were completely destroyed, their staff buried under the massive weight of the roof and air conditioning units that crashed down on them. Shoppers who had come to browse or make purchases were trapped mid-transaction. Families who had brought their children to look at toys in the children's department. Office workers stopping by after work to pick up something on their way home. Elderly shoppers who had been loyal customers since the store opened 5 years earlier. All of them became victims through the simple bad luck of being in the wrong place when a greedy developer's shortcuts finally caught up with him. The families left behind faced not just grief, but often severe financial hardship. Many victims had been breadwinners for their families. Their deaths meant not just emotional devastation, but economic catastrophe. Widows and widowers suddenly found themselves single parents struggling to make ends meet. Parents who had lost adult children faced futures without the support those children would have provided in their old age. The compensation provided by the Sampoong Group, while substantial in total, was distributed among thousands of claimants and took years to fully process. In the meantime, families struggled. Some lost their homes. Children had to drop out of school, The ripple effects of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Survivors faced their own challenges. Many suffered permanent physical injuries, crushed limbs, spinal damage, traumatic brain injuries, organ damage from crushing injuries. Some would never fully recover, facing lives of chronic pain and disability. The young store clerk, who had been excited about her first job, now faced years of painful physical therapy and reconstructed bones. The psychological trauma was equally severe and often less visible. Survivors frequently developed severe anxiety, particularly claustrophobia and fear of buildings. Simple things like entering an elevator or standing in a crowded room could trigger panic attacks. Many experienced recurring nightmares about being trapped in darkness, unable to move, feeling crushing weight all around them. Choi Myeong-seok, the survivor trapped for 9 days, struggled significantly after his rescue despite being physically relatively unharmed. He experienced survivor's guilt. Why had he lived when so many others died? He had difficulty readjusting to normal life, finding the routine concerns of everyday existence trivial compared to the life and death struggle he had experienced in the rubble. Eventually, Choi channeled his experience into a career in structural engineering. He pursued degrees in architecture and structural engineering and spent years working for a construction company, ensuring that the buildings he worked on were safe and properly constructed. His goal was to prevent anyone else from experiencing what he had gone through. He found purpose in taking his trauma and using it to make a positive difference. But not all survivors were able to find such redemption. Some struggled with depression and substance abuse. The trauma of the experience was simply too much to process and integrate into a normal life. Mental health resources for disaster survivors were limited in South Korea in the 1990s, and many people suffered without adequate support. Yoo Ji-hwan, the survivor, pulled out after 12 days, experienced her own difficulties adjusting. The media attention following her rescue was initially overwhelming. She was invited to television interviews and talk shows, asked to recount her ordeal again and again. At first, she handled it with grace, even making light-hearted comments about wanting to date one of her rescuers and drinking iced coffee after being deprived for so long. But constantly reliving the trauma through these interviews took its toll. She began to withdraw, struggling with the expectation that she should feel lucky to be alive when the experience had been so horrific and when so many others had died. Eventually, she largely removed herself from public view, focusing on building a normal life away from media scrutiny. She married and settled into a quiet existence, finding healing in privacy rather than in public remembrance. Park Seung-hyun, the last person rescued after 17 days, became the most famous survivor due to the miraculous nature of her rescue. Her story was covered extensively by international media. She represented hope, the idea that survival was possible even in the most dire circumstances. But this fame came with its own burdens. She too found the constant media attention difficult to manage. The trauma of being buried for 17 days wasn't something that could be neatly packaged into a feel-good story about human resilience. The reality was dark, painful, and traumatic in ways that didn't fit the narrative people wanted from her. She eventually sought normalcy, marrying a classmate of one of the other survivors, and building a life focused on the present rather than the past. The rescue workers and first responders who worked the site also experienced lasting trauma. Many developed post-traumatic stress disorder from the horrific scenes they witnessed and the grueling, emotionally devastating work of searching for survivors and recovering bodies. Firefighters and police officers who thought they had seen everything in their careers found the scale and horror of Sampoong overwhelming. Some rescue workers described being unable to eat certain foods after the disaster because the smells reminded them of the rubble. Others had nightmares about being unable to reach people they could hear calling for help. The psychological support for first responders was inadequate, and many struggled in silence with trauma they felt unable to discuss. The bereaved families formed support groups in the aftermath, coming together to share their grief and to advocate for proper memorialization and ongoing support. These groups became important sources of comfort and community for people who felt isolated in their loss. They organized annual memorial ceremonies and pushed for reforms to prevent future disasters. But tensions sometimes emerged within these groups as well. Some families received larger compensation settlements than others, depending on the circumstances of their loss and the earning potential of the deceased. Some had recovered their loved ones' remains and were able to have proper funerals, while others never had that closure. These differences created complex dynamics within the survivor community. One particularly poignant aspect of the human cost was the number of young lives cut short. Many of the victims were in their teens or 20s, just starting their adult lives. They had barely begun to experience independence, to discover who they would become. All of that potential, all those possible futures, were erased in 20 seconds. Parents who lost children faced unique agonies. They had expected to watch their children grow up, get married, have children of their own. Instead, they had to bury them and face decades of wondering what might have been. Some parents reported that the hardest moments came during what would have been major milestones. The year their child would have graduated college, the age when they likely would have married, the time when they might have become grandparents. The disaster also claimed entire families in some cases. Instances where parents and children shopping together were all killed, where multiple siblings working in the store all perished. These losses left extended families devastated, sometimes leaving elderly grandparents without any direct descendants. The compensation settlement, while financially significant, could never truly compensate for these losses. How do you put a price on a child's life? How do you calculate the value of a future that will never exist? The money helped with practical matters, preventing financial destitution on top of emotional devastation, but it couldn't fill the fundamental void left by the deaths of loved ones. 30 years later, as bereaved families gather annually at the memorial in Yangjae Citizens Forest, the pain remains fresh for many. Time doesn't heal all wounds, it just teaches people to carry them differently. The annual memorial services are filled with tears, with offerings to the dead, with prayers and remembrances. Time has passed, and yet every year we honor those who died in the collapse. One bereaved family member said at a recent ceremony, "We just hope that South Korea will be able to become a safer country." So that hope that the sacrifice of their loved ones might lead to meaningful change that saves future lives is what many families cling to. The reforms that followed the disaster, the improved building codes, the better emergency response, all of these represent a kind of legacy for the victims. Their deaths, while senseless and preventable, at least prompted action that has likely prevented other disasters. But for the families and survivors, these policy changes remain abstract compared to the concrete, daily reality of absence and trauma. The person who isn't there for family dinners, the voice that will never be heard again, the presence that's felt only through its absence. These are the real human costs of the Sampoong Department Store collapse, costs that can never be fully tallied or compensated. Conclusion. The Sampoong Department Store collapse stands as one of the most preventable disasters in modern history, a catastrophe that resulted from a perfect storm of greed, corruption, negligence, and systemic failure. 502 people died not because of an earthquake, a war, or an unavoidable natural disaster, but because a developer wanted to maximize profit, because city officials accepted bribes, because warnings were ignored, and because a society prioritized rapid economic growth over basic safety. Every single death at Sampoong was preventable if Lee Joon had not made dangerous modifications to the building design, if Woosung Construction had not been fired for raising safety concerns, if the support columns had been properly sized, if the building had been constructed with materials meeting code specifications, if the heavy air conditioning units had not been added to the roof, if city officials had not accepted bribes and falsified inspections, if management had evacuated the building when warned it was about to collapse. If any of these failures had been prevented, the disaster would not have occurred. The tragedy of Sampoong is that everyone involved knew better. Engineers warned that the design was unsafe. Construction professionals raised concerns that were ignored. On the day of the collapse, structural engineers explicitly told management the building was in imminent danger. Yet at every decision point, the wrong choice was made, the safe option rejected in favor of saving money or maintaining profit. The disaster revealed the dark underside of South Korea's economic miracle. The gleaming towers and prosperous surface concealed systemic corruption and dangerous practices. The construction boom had been built partly on shoddy workmanship, inadequate oversight, and bribes. Sampoong was the most dramatic failure, but the post-collapse survey revealing that only 2% of Seoul's buildings fully met safety codes showed it was far from the only dangerous structure. In the aftermath, South Korea did implement meaningful reforms. Building codes were strengthened, inspection procedures were improved, disaster response capabilities were developed, the construction industry became more professional. These changes have undoubtedly saved lives over the past 3 decades, making the disaster a catalyst for positive change despite its horrific cost. But the question remains, have the lessons truly been learned, or have they simply faded from memory as time passes and the urgency of the disaster recedes? The families of victims worry that as Seoul's skyline continues to reach higher, as development pressures remain intense, as memories fade, the temptations that led to Sampoong, the shortcuts, the bribes, the prioritization of profit over safety, might return. The memorial in Yangjae Citizens Forest exists to ensure these lessons are not forgotten. The 502 names inscribed there represent not just lives lost, but a collective commitment to remember, to learn, and to do better. Each year, as families gather to honor their dead, they remind South Korean society that the price of negligence is measured in human lives, in families destroyed, in futures stolen. For those of us watching from outside South Korea, the Sampoong disaster offers its own lessons. It reminds us that regulation exists for a reason, that building codes are written in blood, that oversight and inspection are not bureaucratic hindrances, but essential safeguards. It shows us how corruption corrodes not just government efficiency, but public safety. It demonstrates that rapid development without adequate regard for safety carries enormous risks, The story of Sampoong is ultimately a story about what happens when greed is allowed to operate without constraint, when profit is valued above human life, when those in power prioritize personal gain over public welfare. It's a cautionary tale that remains relevant not just in construction, but in any field where cutting corners can lead to catastrophic consequences. As we conclude this examination of the Sampoong Department Store collapse, let us remember Park Seung-hyun trapped for 17 days in darkness, Yoo Ji-hwan surviving 12 days in a space barely large enough for her body, Choi Myeong-seok's 10 days of isolation and fear. Remember the 502 who didn't make it out, whose last moments were filled with terror and pain. Remember the families still gathering at that memorial 3 decades later, still mourning, still hoping their loss meant something. And let us commit to learning from their suffering, to demanding accountability from those in power, to supporting strong regulations and rigorous enforcement, to choosing safety over profit, to valuing human life above economic growth. The victims of Sampoong deserve nothing less than our determination to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most devastating building collapses informative and thought-provoking, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue producing detailed, well-researched content about cases that matter. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.